So it's great to meet together for this our last part of just let someone in. Um, our last part of the book of Margery Kempe. Now, as I say, this is our last meeting, but of course the book group is going to go on. So please don't think this is the end of us being able to talk to each other, because it's not. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start looking at the ladder perfection, or the scale of perfection, as it's often known. My author here calls it the ladder of perfection. We're going to be reading that from the 7th of January. I haven't gone through and actually divided it all up into what sections we'll be reading yet, but once I have, that will be all out on the website. But just to give you an idea, it'll be the 7th of January. And again, that will be for about 10 weeks, about 10 weeks. Now, what I'm aiming is that we start on the 7th of January, but we actually end just before or just after the feast of Walter Hilton, ta-da, which is actually on the 24th of March. So I kind of think that would be very good to end around that time of his feast. Now, the copy that I've got, which is translated by Leo Shirley Price, is actually out of print, but some people have it. Fantastic. Yay. But I've looked high and low to see if I can find if it's in print, and to find actually there are other copies we could use that are in print. But woe and alas, I really am struggling to do that. So because it's out of print, that means that we can actually photocopy up sections of it, scan it in, and then make them accessible on the website for you. So that's what we're aiming to do, is that at least a week before, we'll put the text up. So for those of you who've not been able to get access to the text, you can actually have it. It's a really fabulous book. I'm so excited to read this. It's so different from Margery and so different from The Cloud of Unknowing. It's a little bit, I mean, it's so different from Margery and Julian, but it's slightly similar to The Cloud of Unknowing. But he is one of the most beautiful writers, but he's very clear, and he's very systematic in his understanding of the spiritual life and how we can all deepen our faith through it. So that will be for the new year. But for today, we have dear old Margery to conclude with. So what we've been reading over the last week is the second book. And I don't know about you, but I felt very much last week that there was a real finality when we got to the end of book one. It really felt like an end. And we had this beautiful thing about Margery, finding words of comfort for all her fears that have dogged her through her life, and that she found strength and support in God. And then the final paragraph feels very much one of closure, and it refers once again to the writing of the text. So in a sense, kind of job done. That's it. We've finished. But no, we continue. And so this week we have this sort of odd section, which is now known as book two. So what's going on? What's going on with this second section? It's much shorter. It's not like you have a first volume and then you have a second volume, and the second volume is much bigger than, or they're of equal length, or that they somehow relate to each other. It feels much more like this is a kind of afterthought. Oh, by the way, I've just remembered, this pilgrimage to Germany. I must tell you about that. It feels a bit like that, of that Margery's remembering something and she wants to tell us. And it also feels like we have experienced that there was one text that sat on its own for a while, quite a long while, maybe, don't know, but it sat on itself. And then there was a second edition, and that added on the second book. So that's kind of what it feels like. So we're seeing here a progression in the manuscript. Whether it's in the transmission of the manuscript, we're not so sure, but it's certainly in the construction of the manuscript. There is one part that's talking about the first book, and then another part which is including the second. Now, actually, if we go back all those 10 weeks ago, right at the beginning, we thought about what kind of book we were reading. I don't know if you remember that. All those many moons ago, we thought about, well, what is this kind of book that we're reading? And in that introduction, I spoke very clearly about that there was this whole confusion of scribes and writers, and and who inputted into the book and who was actually writing it. And Margery had this really difficult time of getting someone to write the actual text for her. And if I just find, yes, if I just to remind you that we had this really, if you remember, we had this, first of all, we had this scribe who wrote out the text for her, but it was really messy and it was quite indecipherable. And in a sense, it was a bit hopeless, really. And then she has this second scribe who actually then deciphered the problems of the first one and then copied out the first draft and then added to it. And Margery tells us that at first he was reluctant to make the effort, particularly as Margery had a number of enemies at the time, and he didn't want to get involved. But he says divine intervention changed his mind, changed his attitude to Margery, and enabled him to make out what was written in the book. And this was the one who had that kind of interesting relationship, this Anglo-German relationship, that he may have been married to a German. I don't know if you remember that, but and so it seems that it was this scribe, the second scribe, who first of all rewrote the first book that we've read, and then he added, at Margery's dictation, he tells us, to the second book. So we can see that actually what we're feeling about this text, that it feels like an addendum, is actually what probably happened in reality, is that we have this first text and then the second scribe comes along, completely, organizes it again, and then he adds on this final second book to it. So this edition we're told about it covers 4 years. Now they're quite significant years for Margery, because they are the 4 years between the death of her son and the rewriting of the book. So that really then rings true about what's included in this second book. We have most of it is about Germany, but also a significant part of it is about her son. And we haven't really heard much about her family at all. We've heard a little bit about her husband, but we have heard nothing about her children. And so here we are, a mother who's obviously lost her son, and in the 4 years afterwards, wants it recorded. But also we have a scribe who has a German connections, who is then also saying probably to her, and what about that amazing journey you made to Germany and all the northern shrines? Don't you want that in there? So there's a dialogue going on between Margery and the scribe, the priest writer, to actually add this second section in, which is really fascinating, actually, I find. Now, the other big difference, of course, is the prayers. We had this beautiful moment, and Anthony Bell has sort of captured it at the end of the sort of text, where we move. So on page 224, we have this great kind of, we have the narrative, and then we have Amen and a big asterisk, and then he leaves the page blank. Well, bless him, that's exactly what you find within Margery's manuscript, is that on the folio side, which is the front side, that's the folio side, and then this side is known as reversus. So whenever you look at a page in a manuscript, it will say folio F, and then reversus is for the other side of the page. So that's a little trick for you when you're looking at actually medieval manuscripts, folio and reversus. So on the folio side, you've got exactly that. You've got the end of the text and then a big gap. And then on the reversus, you have obviously this new beginning, this new start of adding in on Margery's prayers. Now, if we read through those prayers, I don't know what you made of them, and it'd be interesting to think about that later in your breakout rooms, what you think about those prayers, whether you feel you could ever use them for yourself. But what's clear is that these prayers are actually probably written down verbatim by Margery. And because you can hear that the text beforehand has got very much the voice of Margery's narrator, the scribe. But when we come to the prayers, they sound very, very different. And they have the appearance and the voice and the tone of being composed by Margery herself. So the rest of the book is telling the story, and then the priest puts that aside and says, right, Margery says, right, I want these prayers down. I'm going to say these prayers to you and write them down. So Margery, throughout the whole of the text, has been a kind of secondhand speaker. So she's been speaking to someone, and then they've been writing it down. Now, they may not have been trying to write down her words verbatim. They probably heard the story, and then they've taken what she said and put it into a text, because that sense of authorship in those days was not as crucial as it is now. So it's a bit like one of you sort of saying, oh, Emma waffled on for a while and this is what she said, and you've written it down. So it'll be a kind of collaboration between what is said and what is written. But what we think in this final bit with the prayers is actually we don't have so much of that collaboration, that actually what we're having is Margery in the first person speaker rather than in the second hand speaker, which I think is rather an amazing thing just to stop and ponder. We've been reading this text, the Book of Margery Kempe, which has been compiled and written by priests, by men. And right at the very end, at last, we have the authentic voice of Margery herself. And I think what an amazing idea that the book ends with Margery allowed to speak. And it's her words that are written down. And that those words that she absolutely wants written down verbatim are prayers. I think that's kind of a magical thought, really. Here we are, this woman from the 14th, 15th century is now on the page. And actually, she hasn't been on the page the whole way through. She's been talked about, the creature, and now we hear Margery, and what she wants us to hear about from her is prayers to God. It seems to ring true also with what we've been experiencing about the person of Margery, that on the surface, she can feel quite an interesting, challenging character, but actually get below the surface, there's a lot more going on and it's a lot more interesting. Now, I went to, do you remember at one point in our book group, I talked about this exhibition at the British Library. Well, hey, I went. I went, and it's brilliant. And it's an exhibition that's running sorry, that's a bit excited, isn't it? And it's running right through till March, and it's called Medieval Women, um, and it's talking for themselves, talking for themselves. And actually, Margery is in there. And if I can show you, this is the book of the catalogue, and it has her actual text. Let me just find you. There we are. There we are. There's the actual text. There's the actual written text, which is fabulous, and you can actually see the manuscript. But what's even more cool is that, do you remember there's a little bit in the text where she talks about how when she hears the voice of God, she smells this really beautiful, sweet smell. Well, they got a little cupboard. There's got a little cupboard you can open up and you can actually smell this really sweet smell. But what's even more cool is that on the other side, there's another cupboard, and it's the smell of brimstone that Julian of Norwich smells when the devil comes to visit her. So yeah, it's fabulous. Do go and have a look at it. But what I think the reason I'm getting excited and saying about it all now is because I think you get a real sense in that exhibition is just how much through the medieval period it was women had to rely on men to then be their mediators to be able to articulate themselves, and how we have these very few examples. Julian of Norwich, of course, is an exceptional example of this, but also the prayers of Margery are an example of this, when women were actually able to speak for themselves. So yes, if you're around in London, please go to it. It's not very expensive and it's well worth having a look at. Anyway, so I get all excited about that, but it is wonderful. So I wonder what I wanted to also kind of end on thinking about. It was, I just made me wonder what it would have been really like if Margery, all the way through, had been able to have a pen in her hand and write her own text. I wonder what kind of text we would have been left if it wasn't men mediating her voice, but Margery was allowed to speak for herself. And I wonder if she might have come across sort of less hysterical, maybe, less self-preoccupied, and maybe we would have a very different view, very different book to have read. I don't know. I just muse. It's something to just kind of think about. Because in a sense, those were the two really big criticisms that people had of Margery's text was, first of all, she wasn't telling the truth, and also that she's very self-preoccupied, and that it was all about her crying and her visions and everything. And if you remember, another one of the earlier talks that I talked about was thinking about what other modern criticisms against her, but also what were the medieval criticisms against her. So I wonder, having got to the end of this book, what you think about her now. Something to have a ponder about and chat about. Now, there are still those people today who would argue that Margery should not be included within the group of the English medieval mystics. those, of course, include the Cloud of Unknowing author, Julian of Norwich, of course, Walter Hilton, and Richard Roll. So those should just be those four. But Margery comes in as the fifth. So I guess we have to question, what do you think about that? Do you think she should be included in that group? Do you think Margery is a mystic or not? Well, I suppose you have to say, well, that depends on how you define being a mystic. You know, do you see a mystic as something which is a very experiential? You know, is it all about what you experience? Or is it about being in a certain state, spiritual state, which is what St. John of the Cross, the Spanish mystics, would sort of say. It's not about what you experience, and that visions actually are to be really guarded against. And I think it's take that lovely line from the Bible, you know, the devil comes as an angel of light. Or do you take a mystic as anyone who can have any experience of the reality of God? So it depends how you understand the word mystic. I guess if we focus on the idea of experience and experiencing an other, or experiencing God, or a vision, or whatever you want to say, then Margery certainly had plenty of visions. But as we say, you know, even she in her own time felt that they were very unreliable. She kept going to people again and again. Even right at the end of book one, we have Margery with his fears and self-doubts that actually what she's seeing and experiencing is not to be trusted. So it feels a very unstable world. And that's not the impression we've had before about what a mystical life is like, that actually it's about peace and contentment and knowing and stability and all that kind of stuff. Well, Margery is certainly not in that realm at all. But she's then again, she is an extraordinary figure who has lived an extraordinarily devoted life, right from, you know, being a brewer and having all her children to leading this life where she's clothed in white and she goes around different places speaking about the reality of God in our midst. So, and she also really knows her faith and her scripture. She's stood up to some of the most powerful churchmen in the land and actually argued them down. So she's quite a remarkable time. And how she's portrayed in the book is that sometimes she's portrayed as her hero, which is Bridget of Sweden, having her visions. But sometimes there's a real Christ-like quality about Margery, particularly when she's undergoing those trials and tribulations. There's something very Christ-like about her. But what's also really interesting is when you look at what she actually describes about her inner spiritual life, and you hold it up, her descriptions, and you hold it up to a later text like St. Teresa of Avila. Now, Teresa of Avila is very systematic in her understanding of the spiritual life, and it can be quite seen as quite progressive steps, which is not always helpful because, you know, it's much easier to think of spiritual life in those terms rather than those terms. But if you hold Margery's experiences and what she describes and place it within the kind of schematics of St. Teresa of Avila, particularly when she's talking about the different mansions of the soul, then it's really clear that Margery is sitting within the realm of someone who is extremely advanced within their contemplative prayer life. So she's sitting in that area which probably Teresa of Avila would say is in that mystical sphere. But the problem, of course, is that when you read Margery, she's not writing a systematic account of her inner spiritual life. There's not an orderly progression there. What we're hearing about is the story of a person's life. And as you know, the story of a person's life is messy. It's there's lots of different aspects. There's the outer world, the inner world, and sometimes the two are very clear. One's very clear and one's not so clear. And you know, it's convoluted. There are lots of people involved. There are lots of liturgy. So a person's life is multi-layered and complex. You can't just take that and then pull it out into a schematic of ranking someone then against whether they're a mystic or not. But what we get from Margery is a real person, and warts and all, the ups and downs of trying to live out a singular life of faith that she feels called to in the late 14th century. But perhaps I would like to argue, perhaps that's why we end up really loving Margery, because that's what we get. We get a really human person at the end of the day in every single way, from her very first, her kind of conversion and all the description of her vanity and her love life with her husband and all that, you know, to this person who is then, you know, being married to Christ and having these sort of really intimate conversations with Christ as if she is now married to him. So, and yet in between you have all these doubts and these fears and these kind of insecurities about what she's actually doing. And then you have this robust and confident woman who stands before the religious authority saying, you know, well, I can tell you a thing or two. You have all this mix, and maybe that's what is delightful about this book and delightful about Margery herself. She hasn't actually got it all sewn up, and she's still questioning, but she's still true to who she is. And I think for me, what I find remarkable about her is that she's constantly showing to her own community, her own world at that time, just how close God is within human encounters. It's through human encounters and within human encounters that she's all the time speaking about God. The places she visits, the liturgy, the preaching, even the trials, you know, God is very real presence to her, and she makes that very real to those around her. So for her, for Margery, God is not a mystical kind of God beyond the Father beyond the veil at all. We are very much dealing for Margery with an incarnational God, a God who is in the mess and the bits and the pieces and the fragments of somebody's ordinary human life. And for Margery, this is an absolutely overwhelming sense of God's reality, incarnation here and now in this world, not in a mystical world of, you know, beyond the clouds. And so if people say that Margery's not a mystic, I'd say, well, all right, she might not go off into that woo land, but she's right here, and she's right here with Jesus Christ in the embodied Christ, the humanity of Christ on earth. And in a sense, I didn't plan this at all. I was kind of thinking, oh, let's do Margery. And I didn't really know how long it would take us to get through. But I've just been reflecting on this afternoon that there seems something really perfect in that we're just going to go into Advent. We're just about to enter into the great preparation for the season of Christmas. And of course, the whole thing about Christmas is not so much just about a tiny baby in a stable. It's what the tiny baby means is that God has become absolutely incarnational into the human life and all that that means. And if there's one person I can say who absolutely gets that, it's Margery Kempe. And so it's a great moment that we end Margery Kempe and then begin the feast, the preparation that leads up to the celebration and I suppose the renewal of our faith in the incarnation of Christ and Christ's presence with us. And I guess presence with us at every and any moment. And I suppose too, the presence that can move us to tears as well, just as it did Margery. So good old Margery, that's what I can say. So that's the end of my kind of introductions to Margery. So I have you, as usual, that I know those of you who wish to leave, you're very welcome to go. And that's an absolutely fine if you need to go. As I say, this is recorded, it'll go up on our website. And I'm just going to share for you the questions. So if any of you want to, it's that one, just have a glimpse of the questions. Let me get down to them. There we are. So hopefully you can see those questions. They're just some of the ponderings that I've been thinking about, but also a chance, a bit like last week, to look back on the whole reading of this text and what you've really enjoyed about it.